All right. It's like just about ready to kick things off here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Deep Watch webinar, Alleviating Alert Overload, Reducing Noise for Better Security Focus. My name is Tom, and I'm a member of the Deep Watch marketing team. I'll be kicking things off here. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, or maybe haven't been familiar with Deep Watch before, we provide security and business leaders peace of mind that their organization is continuously protected 24/7, 365 by a team of expert analysts that act as an extension of your team through our MDR solution. And I want to let everyone know that their audio is going to be on mute to keep background noise to a minimum. So if you do have any questions, feel free to just put those in throughout the live event here. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded, will be available following the live event there. So stay tuned for that. But we do hope you stay here for the live event and engage with us as you wish. So with that, I'll introduce our featured speaker for today, and then pass things off to him. So joining us today is Tim West. Tim is the field CTO at Deep Watch. He's been with Deep Watch for over 4 years and has run everything from operations, engineering, and multiple other roles in the company focused on driving information security outcomes. Tim has extensive experience in security leadership. He has worked as a security practitioner and as a successful security consultant, leading and building practices at some of the largest information security companies in the US. And with that, I'll now hand things over to Tim. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Tom, and thanks for joining us here. I'm going to walk us through effectively how Deep Watch thinks about the alert overload, alert fatigue problem, and how we've helped our customers and really our analysts get to a better level of efficiency and effectiveness in actually doing security analysis work. So I appreciate everybody's time joining. Would love to have questions. If you want to have any questions, you can throw it into the webinar. But we will get started here. So, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about the problem, but I do think that, there's a lot of noise out in the marketplace and hype. We've had probably 2 years of people saying machine learning and AI is going to solve all the problems. And I definitely think, both that Deep Watch has some solutions related around that to help certain use cases in security be more valuable. But I think in general, it's just good to get on the same page that this problem's not going away. And here's a bunch of reasons why we think that's the case. At the bottom line, there's a lot more complexity. We have a lot more options in security when we're building our tech stacks. We're getting a lot more attention as security leaders, and everyone's struggling with getting talent. And these are just 4 different examples in those areas in which people are really struggling to keep up. Most of our customers are going through a cloud adoption in their larger enterprises, so it's a hybrid cloud strategy. We do have a bunch of native cloud companies as well, and we do a lot of CSP detection and response. But for larger enterprises that have both, that means they're getting they already have a tech stack from security for the assets they've had, but now they're working on, what does security in the cloud look like, which means a whole new list of technologies and things to integrate. If you see my next slide, the amount of options in our marketplace have gone crazy. I mean, I don't love my time on the, vendor floor at RSA, but if you remember it 10 years ago and the size from then versus now, you need a map, and you need a personal guide to walk through all of it. I remember when the entrepreneurial fair part of it was only a few companies of what's interesting, and now that has kind of its own showcase center. And I always love these pictograms we'll see next of all the different things that are going on in our industry. And clearly, the amount of attention we're getting from boards isn't going away with the amount of press we're getting. Anybody who can remember 3, 5, 10 years ago, we're not paying attention to quarterly news. We're paying attention to daily news of what new attacks, what new attacker groups are doing. And that means, we have to make sure our signal to noise ratio is well managed. And that is obviously a part of everybody's SOC strategy, is figuring that component out. And then do we have enough people to actually do it, enough talent, enough engineering expertise? If you've seen inflation of labor rates and just the general job changing in infosec or cyber, a lot of people are trying to do more with more, but have the problem of doing more with less just because they don't have the people and people are running around. So if we agree that these trends aren't going away and that they're going to continue to be more complex, what are we going to do about it? Here's that fun. There's a number of people who keep these slides together. These slides keep getting smaller and smaller. Deep Watch is in here down below, but it's so pixelated when you see all the competitors. I just had fun with putting a transparent image over all of them. There are a lot of good competitors in the space, but it's just so many options you can see. Security leaders have plenty of choices to figure out what's the right thing, and then integrating that into your tech stack from a detection perspective is, pretty complicated and pretty annoying that we've given people so many options. Obviously, I like options. More options is better, but it doesn't take away any of the complexity. So I'm just going to jump straight into what's our approach and how do people actually think about these approaches, because I think this is where people break down. There's a lot of hype and talk about, what's the best strategy or how do we actually get to an alerting strategy that gives you, high fidelity, low noise. But I get it. I have a cool job that I get to talk to security leaders pretty often, almost daily. And everybody falls into one of these four boxes. I think this is really just a function of maturity, where they're at in building out their program, how much staff do they have, how sensitive their business is to security breaches, all the way from on the left, your one person infosec team that is just logging into some consoles when they have time between meetings and having a completely ad hoc approach, all the way until when you're actually building and instrumenting a tech stack where you can say you can see X percentage of your environment, and you can talk about what types of alerts and what types of security signals you need to be managing. And there's a lot of organizations we talk to that are, you could call it a compliance focus, you could call it sort of just a severity focus, but they just address highs and criticals, because the rest of it they consider noise until something. Some great tools out there have really high fidelity. EDR tools, especially the ones we support, have extremely good fidelity for highs and critical alerts, but there's a lot of interesting things that you can miss when you're just focusing on sort of a must be this tall to ride approach. And that's also based on workload. A lot of people can be much more thorough, and they get down to a place where they're triaging X% of their environment, but they're still losing things because they just don't have the staff and capabilities to approach it. So they had to make some risk-based trade-offs. There's downsides to all these approaches, all the way from you clearly just don't know what you don't know, to attackers really don't care about what the severity of your attacks are. Red teams, typically, if you're using a successful red team, they're not going to do things that are going to trigger what are the obvious controls that you have maybe on your endpoint or at your different security monitoring tools. But really, we've taken this risk-based approach. We'll show it to you. Part of this whole webinar is to actually get to the weeds and show you what it is, but I wanted to set up the problem, set up exactly how we approach it and how we think it's a different, better approach. So when you can see it, you can kind of put the whole picture together. And so, I think this next slide does a good job getting an idea of, how an alert or a bill becomes a law, right? So our principles are that we want to centralize everything so that we can organize it. There's a lot of tools that can just do this as a one-off. We think that if you're talking about alerts from one single source to one single destination, meaning I triage every single time I get an alert X and then I manually look at it, I think that's a flawed approach. That's what a lot of people are doing. We're going to show you how we actually have context around everything that's going on in an environment with our threat probability value and our threat analytics app. But you effectively start on the left with all of your alerts. We go through a process to dedupe, enrich, and prioritize based on what the context is actually going on within that alert itself. And then we correlate, investigate, and do some automation steps to make us more efficient in that analysis. And we ultimately act and get down to a small fraction of the percentage of things that you would see had you just fired all of your alerts into a queue and try to do it yourself. And so my goal today is to really show you that and demonstrate it, but I wanted to get at least some semblance of how and why we do it. So the first kind of thing from our principals perspective is using all the data we can that's security relevant. A lot of people drop things. I mentioned dropping things based on severity, right? We just don't have the bandwidth to look at all the high, lows and medium alerts. We're not going to look at it. Other people take an approach of, I'm only going to look at certain devices because those are within my compliance scopes. And just unfortunately, attackers don't know what's in your compliance scope and what's on your, PCI cardholder data inventory. They don't really care. They're just trying to get in and get a foothold. And then the last thing, we're a very large proponent. We're one of the largest, if not the single largest user of the technology we chose from a SOAR perspective. We've invested a ton of time to get our analysts to a place where there are fewer steps in the process manually of copying and pasting, doing lookups externally, et cetera. So we leverage SOAR, security orchestration and automation wherever possible. And we'll see a little bit of that when we get to the end. I like real results. So that's all hypothetical, but this is an actual customer. This is a quarter in review. So don't get too afraid by the number of alerts. It's also a fairly large customer. It's 10,000 employee environment. Pretty much our good sweet spot for the customers in our size, but this is a pretty typical quarter for us. And people don't really care about logged events. That's really a technology problem. But if you remember the last slide of that 100%, these are all the things that an analyst could look at within a given point in time in this quarter. But if we threw bodies at that problem, not only would it be outrageously expensive, but we'd send a whole lot of garbage, because once we've picked it up, we'd have to figure out, is there something of note? We'd have to suppress a whole lot. And so we're going to show you how TPV actually gets down to actions alerts that make a whole lot more sense, because it filters out default account logins and GeoIP lookups and all sorts of things that we hear from our customers that they are frustrated getting alerted to, that don't make any sense, that they don't have any action to, that isn't indicative of any compromise, and really get down to the things that are escalated. So our team is actioning X. Oh, the magic mouse of my Apple device is giving me fun. But what gets down to actually escalated to a customer? In a quarter, the customer saw 63 actual tickets out of the amount of alerts that you see here, which is just a huge amount of difference. And they declared 2 incidents. Now, that doesn't mean that whole gap there's a lot of waste. In fact, we track 2 positive and false positive ratios for our customers. You'll see that in our analysis. Some of those could be misconfigurations. Some of those can be analyst things that we can't validate. Things like group policy object modifications, where people got escalated to maybe enterprise or domain admin users, and we don't have the context to know if that was approved. So we had to send that off, because those can be critical, indicators of compromise, that people got excessive privileges. And so the customer still liked 79% of what they got. The rest of those things are tuning opportunities. Anyone who tells you that, they've gotten the world down to 100%, no false positives, I would greatly scrutinize what they're doing to a laughable state. There's too much complexity when you talk about enterprise security for all things, authentication, identity, cloud, network, endpoint. The list goes on that you can identify that are potential indicators that you'll always have 100% true positive rate. But this is a very happy customer that can see the value both in the amount of time we work, but the quality of work and the outcomes that we save them, because they're ultimately seeing these 63 tickets. And if we had time to go into kind of all the operational process of tuning, we're 15 minutes into the hour. We kind of try to keep this tight. We'll probably end up, depending on questions, around the 45-minute mark. We could go all the way into how we tune and make sure we're constantly improving and enriching what we're doing to make that number even go up further. But hopefully this gives you a sense in reality about how our team is getting to a place where operationally, if we're just talking about the alert overload fatigue problem, is doing a great job getting to a place where they are spending time working on things that matter and not spending their time looking at a bunch of alerts that are just wasting their time and taking themselves away from building their security program versus the operations. So we're 15 minutes in. hopefully you've got a good sense of our approach and some of the results that we've seen. I'm going to spend some time actually jumping into how we do it, so it can be a little more interesting, I hope, in understanding how really our analysts do the work. So let me pivot real quick. All right. Let me see. How this works is through our threat probability value. And so threat analytics is our app. Threat probability value is the scoring mechanism we do this. I'm going to just give you this setup so you understand the principles behind how it does. And then the second half of the hour we'll be spending actually looking at it. So a lot of providers, most providers use a SIM. If they don't use a SIM, they're probably just doing more alert reflection, or they have an internal SIM. We think the best way to do this is being portable and transparent. So we use Splunk as a SIM. We make that available to our customers. We're using their Splunk instance, so to speak, the customer Splunk instance that we tie into. But we're using our app on top of that to actually get the results. And so when we talk to customers about where they're at with their own SIM deployment, SIM management, or what they've done with partners in the past, they're just getting alert reflections from all the different log sources that come in. And a manual analyst has to come in and correlate everything when an alert gets fired. You're going to see our risk values is really what makes the real kind of bang for your buck, and understanding how we pivot out of that old way of doing things and creating a bunch of alerts to the better way. And the way we do this is through data normalization, which I think is way more interesting. And the way I think the whole industry is going to be doing this. We map all of your data into consistent data models. Splunk has the common information model. There are other formats for it, but we find that to be highly effective. And what's more interesting is that if you have Palos or CrowdStrike, Okta, Azure AD, a number of different sources, we've actually normalized down to the field extractions each and every type of risk object so that we can see that over time. And like you're going to see this when we look at the demo, that every time I see a username, I think of it as just, we're going to talk about a person named Billy Tunn that, we identified multiple different points from multiple different data sources. We're seeing that as a username. So you can actually look at it and think about what we're doing more like behavioral analytics across all of your enterprise. And then we have a bunch of knowledge gates, triggers about what actually is building our scoring system as we build context around these risk objects. We take in your critical asset lists, we take in privileged user groups, everything we can to contextualize, and then do a lot of anomaly detection based on what we've actually seen from a behavior of these devices themselves, who talks to what, et cetera. So these are just sort of the logic framework that helps build the threat probability value, this risk score that we ultimately equip our analysts to do. And so I'll give you this hypothetical, but we'll show you some live. This is a case where, across multiple different systems, a single risk object like a user can be tracked across Windows, a Linux device, what Palo they actually transgressed because they're getting, that layer 7 data for user ID context. We're seeing what emails they've been sending from our email, security tool that the customer has. And we're ultimately looking at the auth they have, and then tying that together with threat intel and with the context from our customers that we learned through our squad of, is this asset critical to the environment? Is it in subnets? Do we know it from a naming convention? Do we know it from an actual CMDB hook? We can help provide better alerting and more intelligent alerting to what's going on, versus every time one of these things fires, sending you a flood of alerts to tell you that different activities happened without any context. And so what this looks like from a kill chain perspective is that there's a customer defined risk tolerance, and every customer gets their own risk tolerance, and every alert can be customized based on what we understand about their environment. And so in this one particular example, on Monday, we saw lots of increased authentication activity. We'd hope you aren't, wasting your time just looking at increased auth activity because it's Monday. You're probably going to see a lot more alerts on a Monday. There is an account creation with an abnormal name. Now, if you have a very well-structured naming convention system for account creation. You have a really strong IAM process. People shouldn't be adding things in AD with anything beyond your standardized inputs. We might want to change that TPV score to be higher. But for this customer, it doesn't really tell us that the world's on fire, but we want to keep that information in our back pocket. Host command enumeration. We added the score up incrementally a little bit because we actually saw for that user, they're doing some host enumeration. Again, maybe you've got PowerShell locked down really well. You know exactly who in your organization should be doing that, or other types of command execution. But most organizations are pretty diverse, pretty large. They don't know exactly who that, if that in and of itself should be a triggered to them. And the same goes with command execution. We see that, and we could have triggered at 70, but this customer wanted to know when the bad thing happened because they don't have the workforce to review every and all alert. They want to go back to, they have a very high tolerance. So they got alerted when we saw exfiltration. Now, we wouldn't recommend that, frankly, but this kind of gives you a picture of all the options. We can make that tolerance and slide down for your setup. And we could set it at 70. We could set it at 50 if you have more staff and you want to have a, lower fidelity, but you want to have earlier in the kill chain analysis. 70 is around our typical for most customers as we set this up. And you can actually talk through with our squads all the different variables that goes into play to building that score out. But ultimately, the beauty of the system is that it triggered all of these activities so we could see that in a single, in a single alerting dashboard. And instead of alerting you every single time an activity happened, and these activities happen, and you'll see in our case thousands of times in a week or a month, we're only showing you when we actually get to a place where we identify something that has real security relevance and needs to be notified. All right, let's see. I will grab the questions at the end, but we've had a few questions come in. All right. And so lastly, we ran this on Boss of the SOC. We've ran this in our customer environments now. We've found multiple pen tests and red teams that have been phenomenally identified. I wanted to show this data because it's easy to get people's heads wrapped around. If they're familiar with Splunk, they do this great thing called Boss of the SOC. It's a capture the flag activity. It's where analysts kind of showcase their skills. We're pretty pumped that we ran our app on Boss of the SOC data and effectively covered all of the things one would see from a manual analysis perspective. So we're looking forward to the next .conf and running this thing through its paces. Obviously, analysts still have to do the who, what, where, when, and how and engage with the customer. But when it comes down to the detection part before you get to the responding part, we are very proud of how not only did we catch everything, we caught more things. And we did it with having to sift through fewer alerts. And so that really gets to the kind of the power of the message of doing better and having more intellectual analysis done before we actually have to send things to our customers, because we're doing a more robust job building intelligence in customers' environments. All right. And so lastly, my last slide, I broke my time limit. We said we'd be ended up at 30 minutes, so I'm going to get early. This just gives you the payoff pitch before and after. This shows you the amount of alerts you could see before TPV if you were doing an actual, one-for-one single alerting to use case and having to do manual analysis versus TPV alerts. And then the true positive ratio as that changes as it goes up. And so this is before a customer had TPV and they came to us. This is after they had TPV and what they were seeing from their own environment. Same environment, same data set. This is just how they are looking at their own data, doing it sort of I've enabled the use cases, I've enabled alerts, my analysts, look at them, et cetera. So really proud of how there is proof in the pudding. And I think this gets me to the end of the slideware version of this. And now if everybody is out there can be kind and pray to the demo gods so we can actually see this thing in real life. All right. So I'm going to breeze through this. This is our app. You can see it's an app we load into Splunk called Threat Analytics. This is not where an analyst starts. This is where, one of our customers might start to click in just to see health and how to navigate what the data we have. This is really what would start if you were a customer and you wanted to just see what's going on in your environment. Again, these aren't cases that we'd be working, but this is just intelligence over a month of what we want to see in your environment. So this is that same boss of the SOC data. You can see that there's, groupings of things that we could actually look at. One of the fun things that we've built out that we're pretty proud of is the MITRE visualizations. All of our use cases tie back to MITRE. This isn't the capability of this customer, so to speak. This is what actually fired. And so we could drill down into seeing any of these tactics or techniques live for the time period searched. Because I'm on the topic of MITRE, I like showing that there's also, MITRE capability coverage maps. This is dependent on what data you send us. So in this demo instance, we don't have all of the different data sources that could improve that technique score, but this would be indicative of where a customer might find themselves after they've onboarded with us with the security tools they have available to understand what their capabilities are. What can I see in my environment across my tech stack? So back to the screens. This isn't what cases are. This isn't really going to show you, but this is just nice eye candy to give you an idea of, you can click into all these things, and for the sake of not having to load every frame, I've pulled up some things. Really where this methodology shows up is by looking at the actual correlations of what goes on. So again, we have screens to show you everything that fires under the sun, but what's more interesting is the insights and correlations that actually show us how risk objects are behaving in your environment. You can see everything here is tied to a risk object. What alerts fired associated to what devices? And again, a risk object could be an IP address. You can see it could be a domain, a host name. It can be a variety of things. These are effectively the things you want to protect. Had this been more of a cloud-centric customer, it could be APIs. It could be much more app-centric if we have different components in AWS that we want to be protecting. Those would all just be normalized into risk objects as well. But this is more of a corporate enterprise type environment that we're looking at. And Mercury is a domain controller, and so you can see there's activity throughout, and we can actually pivot back into the earlier stages of the attack. But really, the 26th is when, between these 3 days, is really when the payoff window is. And so if we were looking down through the data before we actually got there, we can see that there. This is too late in the kill chain. We're actually seeing, if you can look over my screen and through the gray, we're seeing DNS tunneling. We're seeing some things that would definitely be suspicious beyond that. I'm going to pivot into one of those alerts just to show you what it looks like. This is a lot of what helps us pull signal from the noise, because this specific alert is alerting us on activity for that Mercury domain controller, where in this case, yes, we would tell you about a high alert, and it would bubble up to a TPB score because we're seeing DNS tunneling and a lot of DNS queries from your domain controller. That's an obvious insight that's going to set off red alarms. But look at the number of default logins that we've suppressed while this activity was going on. Yes, someone logged into our domain controller with the user, and I can click into that specific alert and come down here and see all the different types of default activity. But in this 1 week period of my search, we had 7,400 default logins. Not anything relevant for a SOC to look at. Group policy modifications. These aren't just privileged users. This is anytime what we've seen in the search for these objects for when a group policy modification happened. So again, you can choose to be notified more of these depending on your risk tolerance and how well you've set up your IAM structures and controls. But most organizations, when we look at this number is way higher. And that just means that that's something that is not going to be too informative of an indicator of compromise. So we can look and see here. We're seeing DNS tunneling. We're seeing protocol abuse. We also see some other activities. We can pivot around to the other devices that it's actually talking to. But we need to go back in time, because if we're looking at this is a bit too late. We already know that this box has been popped. And if I went through all the drill down searches, and we had time to go through all of the Splunk querying, we would see that, yes, this has been a popped box. We know it's talking to someone, this Hildegard's farm, that's a C2 channel. And that we definitely want to make sure that we're identifying what the actual root compromise was. But we have that data. And so if I go back to my correlations, if we go back in time and we're looking at this, this same timeline, we actually have some user activity that looks suspicious. And so this is way more interesting to pivot into. And we would have alerted on this first because we would have had this in real time. But this is a great example of using low and informational and medium alerts to build context around user behavior that escalates activity to a customer before the bad thing actually happened. So I showed you that slideware version of command shell execution, authentication activity, those things in and of themselves, typically, unless you have a massive SOC that can analyze these different components, you cannot look at those on a one-off basis. But as you can see here, at one point in time on the 24th, and then later on the 26th, we built a case around this user Billy Ton that it's doing some very interesting things. And in fact, one of the cool things that I really love about how we can visualize this is if you just go into that risk object itself, it's doing a TPV trend line, or threat probability value trend line, to compare it against all of your users in your environment, as well as check out what's going on. So on the 24th, this user, whom we've never seen do any of these activities that we just showed you, actually pulls itself out from the noise and identifies itself as definitely a user of interest. And it's doing things that becomes a high alert with a deep watch correlation, multiple tactics observed. We built that analytic on top of just generally what we understand is IT telemetry, right? What are they doing on a host? What accounts are they using? Are we seeing IDS activity in their risk score? So we really built the case around this user earlier on before you got to their exfiltration moment when they found a way to pop that Mercury box. And so there's a lot of power in this. There's a lot of other use cases. I pulled out a few. I like to also show off that you can see for this more in the meta techniques component. But this gives our analysts way more power than looking at a single alert or a drill down search. Because honestly, if you're looking at a typical SIM or email alert that comes fired off of a vendor, they're going to send you ultimately raw alert data, and maybe they put that in nice field forms and boxes. But ultimately, this is the level of intelligence we think that makes a massive difference to getting that signal to noise ratio down to a place where it's way more interesting. And it's allowing you to not have to find the signal and the noise yourself. We're doing it by cross-correlating everything down to that user or risk object identity, which just is a way more powerful approach. Obviously, each and every one of these things would have been a ticket to a customer. And because a lot of these things are actually the same activity that haven't been stopped, we'd be updating the same tickets to say, some, Mercury still popped. We've gone on a severe call. Here's more than updated information. So we could talk through that. But to end up with our story, I think people want to understand, I spent my time focusing on the analytics because the analytics is really what drives the power of getting customers to understand how we're solving the alert fatigue problem and how we're making our analysts more successful. But people want to understand how a bill becomes a law. So this is really where our analysts start their day. This is our XOR instance. Palo tells us we're the second largest user, yet next to their own cloud hosting instance of this. So we're very proud. We started that partnership many years ago before their acquisition. We've built out really a set of playbook libraries that really is untouchable. But let's just talk about this one ticket. So this is effectively what an analyst would look at. It's got the Splunk details. It's got all the data that we saw. Really, you can go into the case details itself and get some of this, or the war room, which is going to show you everything that our XOR instance did from the time this alert ultimately fired to building the case ticket for us. And I won't browse through all these different components, but what this is effectively doing is taking everything of that intelligence that Splunk showed us on those screens as we were manually analyzing it and putting it into a single place. So an analyst can start their investigation to understand, is this real or not? And just by looking at the amount of techniques and in the war room, the detection details, right, will show us the minor techniques that are actually going down. we would want to pivot back into the actual Splunk instance to know exactly what's going on. And listed in here are the actual Splunk links our analysts could click right back into through here to get to that instance that fired this. You know, they would go right back to Billy and start their analysis and start doing manual queries in Splunk to drill down further into what they're seeing so they can write up a case. But ultimately, they have to do some work after that to notify a customer. And it's pretty simple. They have to manually review the incident, pick up ownership of it, complete the task, write up quite a bit of information in here. If I open up the work plan, you'd see this. I will in a second. You know, assign that to a user, whomever that might be, customer SOC, a specific individual, depending on the customer. You know, and set a suspense date based on some SLA components, and then start working through the escalation plan that is specific to that customer that the squad works on. And so if I showed you the work plan, this just gives you a sense of the start of some of the ways in which we help our analysts, you know, track and build metadata around all of their activities. This is a generic playbook just to understand, have they picked up a ticket? What are they actually seeing? Have we manually reviewed the ticket? We can do reports off of this. Have we done the manual review, built notes, closed the notes, updated to our customer? You know, have we set the right severities to get confirmation on what the customer has, and have we notified the customer? And that's just the first playbook. That's their help playbook, not the actual playbook of how we might triage a specific type of event. But I wanted to start here just for, you know, this is kind of helps build guidance and guidelines around how our analysts have to go through their work and building their analyst notes. And ultimately, once they submit their questions, it would fire off into a ServiceNow ticket to give that information, everything you see here, plus their manual analysis, plus all the links back to all of the searches that they ran by looking through the customer's environment to, you know, contextualize and give the who, what, where, when, and why, and, you know, put that case in the customer's review. And potentially, if it's worked through Slack with them, if it's a critical or high ticket and they want to be notified via our Slack, you know, option about what's going on, if it's text messages, they would run those playbooks based on what predetermined steps that they've built from an escalation process to engage that customer, depending on the severity and the type of incident that we're talking about. So that ends the live portion of the demo. I mentioned we're going to get to questions at around the 45-minute mark, and I got there a little bit early. So I got a question. Let's see. I got a few questions here. Let me figure out which one we want to start with. We've got a question of, how does your app compare to Splunk's enterprise security app? Complementary. One of the things that it does is it still builds the same risk table. So we use the same backend. If you're a Splunk user and you're familiar with kind of the risk tables and the KV stores that it ultimately ends up informing it. Ours can be an additional input for how risk-based alerting gets augmented. Obviously, our content library is in our app. And so some of the use cases with Fire would be, you know, in addition to what you get with enterprise security. And so it could help additionally provide context and enrich those risk scores. We don't do much with the assets and identities function that ES has. I think, you know, most of our customers that have ES are larger enterprises that run in a hybrid SOC, meaning they have analysts that do their own triage as well as us. Sometimes that's a workflow function. Sometimes that's because they want to keep things like DLP or employee investigations or other sensitive things away from the hands of an MDR company like us. And so they keep that in-house. And so they use enterprise security for their own incident review and their own alerting queues, et cetera. And so we live nicely with those two different solutions so that both teams can work through their queues and effectively know who's on what base. A few other questions like, how does this compare to what else is out there in the marketplace? Frankly, I think one of the things that makes us different is the transparency of all of the process. I mean, I showed you, and if you're interested in a one-off conversation talking about your data or your interest, we can talk through exactly how this is applied for your data, for your capabilities, for your tech stack, et cetera. And we can walk through how our algorithms work, what use cases are available, what MITRE techniques we can provide you on day one. Most of that is proprietary black box stuff. When you talk to vendors and you really want to get to that level, it's much more of a, you have to trust us. And so you don't really get to see it. I mean, our customers work in the same environments that we work in. Everything we do is transparent to them and us. So I think a lot of how we're different is that we make our methodology open and transparent. We do it as a collaboration together with our customers, and we're always optimizing and improving. So we release new content, at least monthly. We release new features in our application. We build out more playbooks for our own analysts to get better. We've got a whole thing around Demisto templates that's helping our analysts, go faster and cut down on the overhead time. That gets to a better mean time to response, mean time to detect. And yeah, I think beyond that, yes, we do advanced analytics, and there's a lot of interesting things we can talk about and how we use machine learning and AI and some other the buzzwordy tools on how we get to higher level detections. But ultimately, you can see the proof in the pudding, so to speak, in what we actually do. And so I think that makes the partnership much more real. I see Tom is throwing some stuff into the chat. I don't know if everybody else can see that, Tom, but if you want to mention that, it'd be probably helpful.
Definitely. Yeah, we got a few questions around kind of what will this look like for me, or how can we understand what this is like in their own environment. And Tim referenced we can have a call set up for that. So dropped a link in there for the get a demo part. So you can set up time and see this to get a more customized view of this. That's put in there. And some of the other questions I believe were addressed kind of as we went through the demo side of things. So I really appreciate the engagement and activity throughout today's webinar for that as well. And lastly, I put a newer piece of content that we have. No form there, just direct link. You can just get the PDF directly there. For an alert, what we call the alert fatigue ebook. Very similar concepts to what Tim was sharing today, but a little bit more information there that we thought might be valuable to everyone that attended today. But with that, we were trying to keep it to 45 minutes. We're mindful of everybody's time, and it does look like we answered all the questions that we had here. So definitely reach out if there's any follow-up from anybody here who's live or sees this later in the recording as well. Stop by deepwatch.com, and that's the quickest way to kind of get in touch with us and check out some more information on anything you've seen here or some of our other solutions as well. So yeah, just wanted to thank Tim again for walking us through this in such great detail. I thought it was really valuable, and I think a lot of our attendees did as well.
Thanks, Tom. I know it's probably against webinar protocol, but I saw a longtime friend, Dan Holden, jumped in here. I think he actually just bailed right as I was going to say it, but you don't probably give shout outs. I know it's kind of like an anonymized group of people who are out here. So Dan's a lifelong friend, and he's I thought he was too far along in his career to join webinars like this. So I owe him a meal for being kind enough to join us. It's a really sharp guy, but yeah, great audience as far as I can see, all the folks who joined. If you want to reach out to me, I'm Tim at deepwatch.com. I don't know if we publish that somewhere else, but tim.west will do, but I think Tim at will route. It's kind of an indication I've been here a pretty long time, that I've got the market cornered on the first name email address. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Would love to discuss any of the stuff that we talked here. And thanks for the invite, Tom, to do this.
Yeah, my pleasure. So yeah, thanks again, everybody who could join today or catches this on the recording, and hope to see you on the next one or at some of the upcoming events at RSA, Gardner, Splunk.conf. It's going to be a busy summer for everybody, so definitely connect with us either online or in person. And yeah, thanks again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.